Welcome, everybody. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya. I'm a professor of medicine at Stanford University, and I'm conversing today with Professor John Ioannidis, my good friend, also professor at medicine at Stanford University. John, thank you for making the time to talk. I have put together a list of questions, and I figured what we do is I just bring a question up, you start, we'll have a little conversation. There's 10 questions, and so...
Sounds wonderful. We can make them 100.
Okay. Maybe next time we'll have to have 10 of these then. Okay, so John, I want to start by talking about how deadly COVID actually is, and why is it so strangely difficult to get an answer to that, and why has it been so controversial? Obviously, because we worked together on this, that we worked on the Santa Clara seroprevalence study, which measured antibodies in the population of Santa Clara County in early April of 2020. And we found 2.8% of the population of Santa Clara County very early in the pandemic had antibodies. That led us to an infection fatality rate. Infection fatality rate, the number of people that had died up to that time, divided by the number of people in the county we thought had COVID, based on the antibodies, about 0.2%, 99.8% survived, right? So tell us, can you tell me your view of that study, and then your view of the literature, how it's evolved, since then, in terms of what the infection fatality rate actually is for COVID?
Well, Jay, as you know, that was an early study, and people were struggling to understand in what ballpark are we playing. And there were very widely discrepant views. Some people proposing estimates of infection fatality rate that were based on what we were observing, which were just the people who we had documented infection. And based on what we know now, these were just a very tiny minority, especially with the little testing that we were doing back then. And others who were far more optimistic, and they were thinking that, there's a whole iceberg that we need to reveal, and we just see the tip of the iceberg. So it was a study that, at the time that it happened, it could be very informative, and I think it was informative. Since then, we have about 3,000 seroprevalence estimates in different settings, in different locations, in different situations, in different populations, in different mix-up of people who are infected. And one cannot give a single answer, because this virus has a tremendous gradient of risk. I think that this is probably the strongest risk gradient that I have seen in my career as an epidemiologist. Throughout my life, I was happy when I was discovering gene variants that would increase your risk by 1.02-fold. And now we have something that has a risk gradient across young versus very elderly and debilitated of 10,000-fold. So this is very unique. And that also means that the infection fatality rate depends tremendously on what is the case mix. What kind of setting, what kind of population is infected, and what kind of population we're protecting not to be infected.
So the old, very, very high risk from bad
If you have an outbreak in kindergarten, your infection fatality rate is going to be 0.00. I mean, you start adding zeros. Some kids will die, unfortunately, and every single death, regardless of age, is a tragedy, but you really need to add a lot of zeros, and then some digit. If you go to a frail population in a nursing home with lots of comorbidities, it could be 25%. 1 out of 4 people who are infected will die. Now, a real-world population has some kindergarten and some nursing homes, some young, some middle-aged, some elderly, some people with frailty, some people with comorbidities, some people with many comorbidities. So your eventual number is not really just up to the virus. It is up to what you do to avoid the virus really hitting you hard and being able to protect those who need to be protected. Ideally, I would not want to have anyone being infected, but we are in a situation where probably we have 360 million documented cases, but probably we have like 5 billion infections that have happened, and we see that we still have very active epidemic waves. So people do get infected. I wish we could have fewer people infected, but the big issue is how to avoid having those who would be a massacre if they get infected.
So that's question 2, John.
Ah, goodness!
On precision shielding. So you're jumping
very
ahead.
fast.
So let me. But no, actually, because before we get on to the question, I had a couple of thoughts about and questions about your experience in writing about the infection fatality rate. In particular, I've seen, obviously you've written some very interesting summaries of those 3,000 plus estimates, and the estimates you get are much closer to 0.2, 0.15. I mean, I don't know what your favorite number is for the overall, and you're absolutely right. The gradient is so steep, especially by age, by institutional settings. So nursing homes are worse. There's not one single number, right? You have this enormous variation, what I've seen in the literature though, is that everyone focuses on the single number, right? And so you have your analyses where you publish a rate something like 0.2 for the whole world, 0.15 for the whole world, and there are also competing analyses that find much higher numbers, 0.5, 0.6, higher numbers. Why is there that discrepancy in the literature? Is that common in these kinds of literatures to find such a discrepancy? Is it simply just because of a different case mix that they're considering?
I think that it is not uncommon. And the reason for that is that you need to make a lot of decisions about which studies are eligible to be included in the calculations, and also what exact numbers go to the calculation of that fraction. So you need to estimate how many people are infected, and then also how many people died. So it may sound a bit weird, but even for how many people died, even though death is the most obvious outcome, there can be some uncertainty about how exactly you should measure that. For example, how much time you should leave for people from the time that they're infected until you start counting and you stop counting deaths as being related to that infection, whether we have been able to capture deaths
you have a paper
reliably.
about that, right? So.
Indeed, I wrote a paper trying to take a step back and think of classic epidemiological theory with some improvements, trying to think whether we underestimate or overestimate COVID-19 related deaths. And the answer is that in some settings we underestimate them, and in some other settings we overestimate them. In the same country, probably we may overestimate and underestimate in different time periods. For example, in the US, probably we underestimated deaths in the very early months of the pandemic because we were doing very limited testing. I think currently probably we are overestimating deaths because we do tremendous amount of testing. And I mean, if you just wait for labeling you have a positive test and then you die, lots of people die with a positive test. And across the world, that picture and that relative balance of over and underestimation is very different. So there's lots of decisions that need to be made in these calculations. And if you choose different studies, if you choose different interpretations of these studies, if you choose different reading of the numbers, you can get results that are not the same. Now, even those studies that disagree, I think if you look very carefully, they don't disagree that much. So maybe there's like a twofold difference, but it's nothing compared to the tenfold difference or more that these estimates have compared to the early expectations. And I think that it's completely open to look at the numbers and have some diversity of how exactly they should be read. But probably the estimates that I gave both in the bulletin of the WHO paper and the AJCI paper and then some subsequent work that I did with Catherine Axfors, I think that they're probably within the range that other people have observed as well.
Yeah, so the facts I take away, I think they're completely uncontroversial, is what you said about the risk gradient, the incredible dependency of the fatality rate by age. So let's move on to question 2. What do we do with that fact? Because that seems extraordinary, and you actually alluded to this. Like in epidemiology, you're looking for things with a large risk gradient because they can use that to do, for instance, personalized medicine. Depends on that, right? If I have factors that I find in you that have very steep gradients, then I can tailor my therapy for the set of factors you particularly have that I wouldn't give to somebody else, right? That's the philosophy of personalized medicine. So what would we do with that fact epidemiologically, this age gradient? I have some ideas.
Before the pandemic came along, we had a lot of enthusiasm about precision medicine, or personalized medicine, or individualized medicine. And what is the premise of that? The premise is that we want interventions to be tailored to the individual. Every person is different. Every person has different risks, has a different background, has different circumstances, has different genetics, has different comorbidities, different risk factors, different lifestyle. And we want to use that information to be able to tailor the best management, the best prevention, the best treatment, depending on what arises for each individual. Now, this precision medicine approach had a lot of followers, and I would say that it was mainstream. It was like a bandwagon term. Everybody wanted to switch from average medicine, which means that everybody will be treated in the same way, and everybody will get the same preventive approach, and you're not going to get anything special.
So you want to tailor the treatment to this particular characteristics of the person you're treating. You treat each person as a person.
Exactly.
Right?
So it was very attractive, and lots of work was focused on trying to achieve that. I have to say that we had modest successes. Some of the disciplines of science that absorbed the largest amount of funding, like genetics, for example, genetics and genomics. Why did we have all of that money going to genomics? Because supposedly it would lead us to precision medicine, to individualized medicine, to personalized medicine. It did to some extent, but not to the point that we wanted, because as I said, most of these risk factors that we were discovering were risk factors of 1.02-fold difference in risk at a time. So even if you get 100 of them, which we could, maybe you get two-fold difference or three-fold difference, but no better than that. So here, with COVID-19, suddenly we come across situations where we really see that people are extremely different.
So I just want to take back to the timing of this, because I think the timing is really important. When did we know that there was this enormous age gradient in risk?
Very, very early. I think that we were suspecting it from probably the very first days when we started seeing some of the fatalities kind of concentrated in people who were older and debilitated.
I remember the Chinese data came out,
Yeah.
and it was so stark. No kids had died in their data sets, and in enormous numbers of older people.
I think that we had a sense that that was the case maybe in February or so, clearly by March. And the question is, what exactly is the steepness of that risk? And are there any peculiarities? Can we make it more granular? Because it's not just age, it's also comorbidities. What are the exact effects of comorbidities, like obesity, for example, or having smoked in the past and having...
So, I mean, I remember in the early days, asthma was seen as a big risk, but probably less so now.
It kind of fell into a lower risk profile.
Okay, but age has stayed. That was identified early. Now you wrote a paper about, you called it precision shielding. So can you describe that idea?
So that paper was an effort again to use epidemiology and extend it to that particular problem, and try to estimate how are we doing in terms of protecting people who are at high risk versus people who are at low risk. And you could use different types of contrasts on who is the low risk and high risk.
Just so everyone understands. So what you mean is, one country says, let's try to protect everybody equally. Another country says, let's try to focus our protection on the old. This is kind of like the Great Barrington Declaration idea, focus protection. The question is, which country does better in terms of protecting its population from death, right? Is that
That's the equivalent at the policy level, but of course, as you understand, it's one thing what you want to do as policy, and it's another thing what actually happens.
Yes,
because,
of course.
You know, as policy, I could say, I want to save the world, and no one will die. And who says that? No, Ioannidis. Yes, and then millions die. And I tried, but my policy did not work. So it's an issue both of practicality and whether the policy can really be translated to the real world.
Okay, so let's hold off on the policy. Let's just describe the precision shielding idea.
So here's the concept. You have populations who can be broken down to groups of high risk and low risk. And you can look at whatever contrast you want. So an easy contrast is to look at elderly versus non-elderly, and you can set some threshold, let's say 65 years old or 70 or 60. You can do it whichever way you want. And you can look at people who are in nursing home and long-term care facilities versus others who are community dwelling, and then compare these two groups. So if you measure the infection rates, the seroprevalence, for example, how many people have antibodies, which are an indicator that they have been exposed in the past, you can see how many people, what is the proportion of people who have been infected in the high-risk group, whichever way you define it, and the low-risk group.
Right. And ideally, policy would aim to protecting the high-risk group because that's where you get the worst
Primarily,
outcomes. Right.
yes. I mean, ideally, as I said, I want no one to be infected.
Yes, of course.
But the reality is that, as I said, right now we have, who knows, maybe 5 billion infections. So infections do happen. And for a highly infectious virus like this one, it's practically impossible to completely avoid it. So if you have infections...
Actually, let's hold that thought.
Okay.
Is zero COVID possible? I'm sorry I interrupted you. No, we'll come back to that in a minute.
We'll come back to that because zero depends. Is it zero? Is it one? Is it two? Is it a million?
Okay.
I mean, we have to decide what is zero. But I'm coming back to the precision shielding idea. So you can look at the data from seroprevalence studies and see what is the percentage of the high risk versus the percentage of the low risk. And other things being equal, you want a lower percentage in the high-risk population. So you want a lower percentage in nursing homes. You want a lower percentage in long-term care facilities. You want a lower percentage in elderly people. Because if you let these people infected, then you get a massacre. Unfortunately, what happened in real life, and we saw that, in countries that had very stringent lockdown policies, we saw the exact opposite. This happened practically in every European country, more or less, with few exceptions that had stringent lockdowns and still had a lot of deaths in the first wave. We had massive deaths in nursing homes. A few countries managed to avoid this, but not that many. We saw the same in the US. We saw massive deaths in nursing homes. When we go back and we do seroprevalence studies in populations in long-term care facilities, we see that their infection rates were multiple times higher compared to the general population. In some cases, you had infection rates of 2%, 5%.
Negative shielding then.
Yeah, in the general population, and you had like 50% infection rate in nursing homes. So this is inverse protection. In a way, we let the virus go and hit those places and those populations who we should have protected much better.
I mean, the idea of lockdown was to slow down community spread and thereby protect the vulnerable, right? That was the theory, and you still hear it today, right? Why you're letting the virus.
It was a misplaced theory, because of course, when you have an active epidemic wave, you need to do things to try to limit your exposures. So I would not argue that if you have an active epidemic wave, you should have mass gatherings, more than you had before, and just have everyone maximally exposed to get infected. I mean, it doesn't make sense. You have to make a very strong message. We have a problem. It's a deadly virus out there. We need to protect ourselves and protect others. Try to minimize your exposures. You can still carry on with essential things about your life and keeping your mental health intact and keeping your schools and your kids at school, but that's not probably an opportunity to do wild things with very heavy exposures. But the way that lockdowns were applied, they did nothing practically in most countries to protect those who had to be protected. If anything, they made these people more susceptible because nursing homes and long-term care facilities, they were not protected. We had very limited testing. We had staff that were moving from one nursing home to another in many countries like Sweden and many other places. So people got
States too.
Massively infected. Same thing happened in the States in many facilities. These people were abandoned. We didn't have just COVID-19. There was panic, there was fear, they were let to die from thirst and hunger in many cases.
In Quebec, I know I heard that. Yeah.
We have a very nice review by Kyle Hennigan on this topic, looking at the ripple effects of what really happened in long-term care facilities. We had excess deaths that were far more than just the COVID infection, which was a tremendous
There's
problem.
evidence of deaths from loneliness at these facilities.
Of course. Right. So in a way, the lockdown and the panic that it instilled did exactly the opposite. It just led these people to their fate. It actually accelerated their fate. It did their best to kill them in a way.
Yeah.
And then for the elderly who were in the general population and those who were vulnerable, I think we did very little. Because the lockdown protected people who were mostly more healthy than the average person. It protected people like me, who, could
We
do all
play
my
Frisbee
work.
sometimes, so
Yeah, but
not very well.
but not very well. Yeah, we can probably practice better on that. But I could do all my work practically with Zoom, and I could teach and lecture and do everything. Well, other people who were in much worse health than me, who had less health coverage or no health coverage, were out there in the street as essential workers fighting with a pandemic for me to survive, who had no need to be protected practically.
I mean, essentially, I like to use the term laptop class. We protected the set of
Yeah.
people who could work from home, from their laptop or desktop computer without losing their work. And the essential worker class, whether they were old or vulnerable, they were asked to go work and
Exactly.
be exposed to the virus.
Exactly. And these people are the majority. Of course, probably they're not the majority in my community, which is
There's a
mostly
nationwide
professionals.
estimate, actually, an economist did. In the United States, about 30% of workers like this.
Okay.
Where you could replace the work.
But if you look at a global perspective, I think
much
that,
worse,
that they're
yeah.
clearly the majority.
In fact, there was there was a study, a seroprevalence study done in Mumbai in summer of 2020 that found that in the slums of Mumbai, the seroprevalence was something like 60, 70%. And in the rest of Mumbai, it was 20%.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Precision shielding of the rich.
At a global level, lockdowns made things worse because we thought of a very ideal situation where humans are like pawns or little robots that we turn off the switch and we place them in a room and they stay there for 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, I don't know, 30 years, please no. and then this is it. And that has nothing to do with reality. I mean, I can't believe that someone who has some common sense and some minimal knowledge of public health would have proposed this.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
So I mean, now you made a case then that the lockdowns, in terms of what they were aiming to do, which is to protect the population from COVID, failed to protect those who were most vulnerable.
Indeed.
What about the other effects of lockdowns? I think you already alluded to some of them, right? Like the psychological harm from having to be apart from each other is actually, that's a real thing.
It's horrible because a pandemic, especially a pandemic as deadly as COVID-19, is a major challenge for all of us. It's a major challenge for our communities, for humans as societies, as human beings. It's like the extreme stress that you can get. So people who were stressed, there's no one to blame for that because it is anticipated that you will be maximally stressed. It is a little bit like running a marathon, and it's not a marathon that a single person is running. It is a whole cohort of people who are running that marathon. And what we want to get is to have everyone finish that marathon with as good timing as possible. I mean, some people are slower and some people are faster, but we want everybody to be able to get to the end and still be alive. So the lockdown philosophy and restrictive measures and aggressive measures and continuous bombardment by media and social media and everything that there's irresponsible people and we need more aggressive, you're not doing enough.
And if you say the IFR is infection fatality rate is 0.2%, well,
yeah, then you're a horrible person. I mean, you want to kill people. You want to,
because you're telling the truth about what the death rate is.
I'm sorry. I mean, these are the numbers. What can I say? The numbers are both wonderful and horrible at the same time. Yeah. It was good news, but at the same time horrible news, because if you take the IFR for the vulnerable and the elderly, that's really apocalyptic. So the question is, how do you move out of there, and how do you run that marathon without flogging the runners? Because what we did with lockdown and with aggressive measures, it was as if we took that cohort of people and we started flogging them. They had to run 42 kilometers, and at the same time we were flogging them.
There's a literal thing. So in the early days of the lockdown in India, 10 million migrant workers were forced to go back to their home villages. They're working in big cities.
Very poor choice.
Hand to mouth, right? So they buy the coconuts for the day, they sell the coconuts. With the money, they buy food for their family and coconuts to sell the next day. Immediately there's a lockdown order. You're not going to sell your coconuts because no one's in the streets. And then their order is to go back home. Home is sometimes 1,000 miles away. There's no organized movement. There's just a disorganized rush to send 10 million people on a trail of tears, it's been called, and where 1,000 died overnight.
It is horrible, and very little of that, or none of that, was in the news. Very little of that was within our screens. I mean, we had, as you say, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, disadvantaged people all over the world who were suffering, who were dying. Were dying from starvation, from hunger, I mean, from things that, goodness, we should have done something. And at the same time, we're just measuring cases, in Palo Alto.
Yeah.
So it's really a shame that we let that happen, that we just lost the perspective of what really matters. And I think that probably we have lost lots of people, far more than what we have counted. Not because of the virus itself. The virus was horrible and it was a major problem, but mostly because of what we did and how we responded to it.
Yeah, I mean, my first guess is that if you take the set of lives saved by lockdown, which I think is, I mean, we'll have a lot of debate. We'll probably debate that for the rest of my life. But let's just take that as whatever number you want for that. The number of people that died from a consequence of the lockdowns themselves, the collateral harm is orders of magnitude more.
I think that I agree with you. And the biggest problem is that we will never reach consensus on this, because people have not paid attention on capturing these other dimensions with the same level of granularity as we did for COVID-19 per se and infections from COVID-19. And we have an indirect tool through excess deaths. But as you know, excess deaths are extremely difficult to model.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on what assumptions you make, what is your pre-pandemic period, what kind of time series you use, what kind of autoregression coefficients you want to correct
and then
for.
also you can't tell what the source of the excess death was, right?
So let's say that you go through that first mess
yes.
and you get some estimates which are very fragile, and then you have to say, so then what really killed these people?
Yeah.
What was the real underlying cause? And you cannot answer, and I think many people make that mistake, it was the virus. Well, yes, the virus was a major threat, but it was not just the virus. It was the virus plus what we did.
Well, I think if you're seeing the deaths in younger populations, high excess deaths in younger populations, it's very difficult, I think, to attribute that to the virus.
Yeah.
It just doesn't.
There's no way to attribute it to the virus. So indeed, there, I think you get a much cleaner picture of the impact of what we did.
Right.
And it's very sad based on what I have seen so far. The numbers are not final, and I hope that they're exaggerated, because all scientific literature has a tendency to exaggeration in early estimates, but I think that it would be lamentable eventually if we take a close look at these numbers.
Okay, John, we actually covered question 3.
Nice.
Let's do question 4. Question 4, was there ever really a consensus in favor of lockdown?
Depends on whom you ask. I think that...
well, can I come with my thinking in setting this question up, right? So it felt in the early days of the pandemic, if you were against the lockdown, that you were alone. At least I felt alone. Mm-hmm. And I saw your Stat News piece in the early days of the epidemic. I was thinking along the same lines, and in fact I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal with a very similar argument. And it was amazing to find you, John, because I thought that I had gone crazy, that I was looking at this wrong. What I've found since is that there were many scientists who felt the same way, but didn't really. The environment was so oppressive that it was difficult to speak up.
You're absolutely right about that, and the problem is that we had an official stance in different locations and different countries. And we also had media, and we also had social media kind of supporting usually whatever that official stance would have been. It was very difficult to have a different narrative. And who determined that stance? I still don't know. I think it's a little bit like herd, and I'm not talking about herd immunity. I'm thinking of herd mentality here, that once you have, let's say, one politician take a very aggressive stance and say, I'm going for a very aggressive lockdown, then everybody else, every other politician will say,
Well,
if I don't do that, they will tell me that I didn't do enough.
Aren't scientists supposed to be sort of independent-minded, a little bit contrary?
Yeah, in my utopian world, maybe, but goodness, we're not. Yeah. We're not. We're just biased humans. I feel that I'm biased all the time. I'm just struggling to understand my biases and hopefully sometimes get rid of a few of them. It's not easy, and it's not easy even less so when you have an environment that is so dominant and so pervasive and so high-pitched that we know what we need to do, and everybody else is doing it. Yes, we all do that. We all say the same thing. So was it a consensus? I don't know. I mean, I had the same experience. I've heard from hundreds and thousands of scientists who felt that was entirely stupid. But if you were to ask, so can you say that? No, I cannot say that. Let me be honest. In the beginning, I thought that lockdown was a good idea. I have to apologize for this, retrospectively. But I put my weight for whatever weight I might have, maybe none at all. But John Ioannidis, what do you think? In my early interviews in several countries, I said, it's a good thing that we do that. Why? Because as I wrote in my stat piece, we have no clue what we're dealing about. So that stat piece says it could be up to 40 million deaths within a couple of months. I was talking about within a couple of months. So if it's 40 million deaths within a couple of months, you don't want to risk that. You want to find out about what you're dealing with and then decide.
So let's explore that for just a second, because I think that's really interesting, right? So I mean, and normally people talk about that. They'll say this is the precautionary principle.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
But like in my view of the precautionary principle, you still have benefits and costs of an action.
Indeed. Yeah.
And the precautionary principle says, well, let's assume the worst about the nature of the thing you're trying to prevent. In this case, the deaths from COVID itself. Let's assume that if we did literally nothing, we'd get millions and millions of deaths, right?
Yeah.
Then you have to still compare that against the harms from the policy. And you're not allowed, in the context of the precautionary principle, to assume that the policy has no harms. You can't assume simultaneously the worst about the disease and the best about the policy. You still have to have a sober-minded evaluation of the harms.
I'm on the same wavelength, but I'm a lockdown supporter, Jay, okay? I was a lockdown supporter back then because I said, okay, you're telling me 40 million deaths. I do have concerns about harms. To be honest, I had no clue what the harms would be, but there were concerns, real concerns about harms and ripple effects on multiple other dimensions. But you're telling me that 40 million deaths are on the table? I cannot really afford that. So, okay, I'm one of you. I agree with the lockdown for a few weeks until we find out what we're dealing with, until we sort out the risks,
the seroprevalence studies.
The seroprevalence, the infection fatality rates, the distributions, the risk gradients, and then we can revisit. It may be that we just need to shut down forever. And, that was the last glimpse of humanity on planet Earth. We now all go underground into one room per person. I mean, I don't know, maybe, if we had a virus that would kill 8 billion people, maybe that would have been the solution. But within a few weeks, I think the picture became far more clear. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a serious risk, a risk that is going to be horrible if it is mishandled, if we let the vulnerable and the frail people to be affected. It will be a disaster. But we have a very different picture compared to 40 million deaths within just a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and kind of everyone being affected and everyone dying in the streets.
Right. So
that's
the absolute magnitude matters of the infection fatality rate as well as the gradient. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Both things matter, and then all the other considerations about risks and benefits become extremely relevant.
Yeah.
And then you need to decide what to do to minimize the harm, to get that cohort of marathon runners to be able to finish. And based on past pandemics, that this is not going to be 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months. Pandemic lasts 2 years, 3 years. The way we have handled that, whether we try to protract things, it may last even longer.
Well, I mean, in many ways, we misled the public. We said, 2 weeks to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
Just another couple of months.
Where have you seen a pandemic that lasted for 2 weeks? I mean, for a virus of that sort. So we should have been honest to ourselves to say that we are going for the long term. And the long term as we see it now, means that this virus is going to be with us probably, who knows, until the end of human species,
Okay,
which
so
I hope
now
is not very
is a
soon.
good time. Now is a good time to talk about zero COVID.
Okay.
Was it ever possible? Just to set it up, people will sometimes point to SARS-1,
Yeah.
which has disappeared. No, I don't believe really with concerted human action, but it disappeared, right?
Well, SARS-1 and SARS-2 are very different beasts. One has an amazingly higher average infection fatality rate compared to the other, which has that very peculiar gradient. It's far more difficult to transmit. It kills people who are infected, really, much of the time, most of the time, perhaps. And that's a very different story. So for something that is so widespread, it's not really possible to do
So
that.
the high transmissibility made it impossible. Was it like, let's say we had, sometimes you'll hear zero COVID people lament that we didn't have a sharper lockdown, say in March. Would that have led to zero?
So I'm trying to think, for the argument in favor of this happening. Do we have an example that was very successful? I want to give it the benefit of the doubt. Australia, New Zealand,
but it hit
China.
there. It hit. So just take Australia and New Zealand. Those are island nations. It hit during their summer, which seems to be during COVID low season.
Perhaps if you have a situation that you have a very limited burden, a very limited seeding burden, okay, and you really close the door. So Australia is an island, and New Zealand is an island. Maybe you can avoid it for some time. But as you see now, Australia now has huge epidemic waves. China, I really don't know exactly what happened in China and what kind of measures they took. I see now that they put people in containers when they need to be quarantined. If we put people in containers, would it have worked in the US?
Someone has to put the person in the container.
Oh, goodness. I don't want to see
how about
this.
Newborn babies? Do they belong in containers by themselves? I think that kind of policy is not humane. And I don't. Whether it works or not.
I cannot defend that policy by any means.
Yeah.
And I really don't know eventually what it means, other than the early ability to contain an epidemic wave. The epidemic wave will come sooner or later. And for these viruses, influenza has been for us for thousands of years, and it comes back again and again, and each year is a different year, and one year is going to be 1918.
Though.
It's not smallpox. It's not the same. It's very different. I wish that we could get rid of SARS-CoV-2, but we have animal reservoirs. We have
80% of white-tailed deer apparently have antibodies.
Goodness, we have billions of people who are infected. We have a situation that is not congruent with zero COVID. Now, I have debated with people who believe in zero COVID, and I'm trying to find some common ground. So, it boils down to asking, well, maybe by zero you mean a few billion people being infected? That sounds reasonable. Not having 8 billion.
I think it comes back down to policy, right? So, April 2020, we find 2.8% of Santa Clara County is infected. Mm-hmm. Shows evidence of previous infection, right? So it's 50 times more infections than cases. We don't, as you said, we didn't have the ability to test early was not particularly great. Was it too late by then?
Absolutely, yeah. Even containers would not work.
Yes, yeah.
So I think if you have 2.5% of the population, you're talking about tens of thousands of people out there who are infected. So and with very limited testing back then, you're not capturing the vast majority. So
now, but what if the United States and Europe had great testing and the rest of the world didn't?
I was very much in favor of testing, and I remember that we've had debates in the past. I was a testing person because I like to have eyes on the virus and where it goes, and try to capture.
Well, I like data too, John.
Well, some kind of a professional viciousness in the epidemiologist in me, but no, I defended testing and aggressive testing, and I think that countries that started with aggressive testing in the beginning, and in some of my early interviews, in the very, very beginning, like, February, March, I gave Iceland as a nice example because they were doing very extensive testing. Singapore, same thing. South Korea, they had eyes on the distribution of the epidemic wave in the community. And if you have that, you have one more reason not to have people who they're infected to go take care of your grandfather or to go work on a nursing home.
Right.
So I think that there's some reasoning behind that. In countries that did lots of testing in the early days,
depends on what you use it for, right? So we have an enormous amount of testing resources now used to essentially keep kids home from school if they happen to be next to somebody who tests positive.
Yeah. No, I think that testing now has become kind of an other obstacle in a way towards reaching normality. And the question is, can we incorporate it in a way that it is not disruptive? I think that that's the big balance. I still believe that we need testing to protect, especially high-risk facilities. I think it's unacceptable not to have testing in high-risk environments. Again, my bias, I like data, I like big numbers, but it's different now. It's different. Right now, we have 75 million people with documented infection in the US, and probably you need to multiply that by, 3 or 4 times, perhaps more, for the total number of infections. Many people have been infected 2 times, some people have been infected 3 times. Now it's too late. It's too late. And people think that we can just bring the past to the present, and science cannot do that. We cannot revert time. I don't know, maybe
John, I'm waiting for you to get a time machine.
Yeah, so we need some physics person here.
Okay, this is the 5th question, so we're almost halfway done, John.
Good.
The forecasts of the pandemic have driven policy in many ways. We have this beautiful model, these compartment models of, sometimes called SIR models, susceptible, infected, recovered. They might have other components, might be more complicated. The most famous one during the pandemic being Neil Ferguson's Imperial College model. And it's driven policy in a way that is absolutely remarkable to me. I've worked in health policy for many years. I've never seen these kinds of models, which are, I think, very useful tools, that drive policy in such a fine-tuned way. What is your assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of these models and how they've been applied during the pandemic?
I've published several papers on this.
I know you have. That's why I asked the question.
I think that we just got grossly misled by models. I love models. I run many models myself. I think mine are the worst of all. But we just could not communicate to policymakers what models are. Models are models. Goodness. And they need to be tailored against reality. They need to be appraised against reality. They need to be corrected against reality. So what we saw was that everyone who was doing mathematical modeling and people who had not done mathematical modeling just as well were just getting models out there. And the most ominous the model, the higher the value. And I think we saw that in large scale. We saw it in multiple countries. Our models were more influential than others. And I think that I don't want to blame anyone because I think that they did everything with the best of intentions and they wanted to help. And they said the world is facing a major crisis. We want to put our skills to the task. But I think that they created chaos. Now, could we have done better? Should we have thrown models out the window? No. They're valuable, but we could have.
So how should they be used? Like I always have thought of them as something where it allows you to understand trade-offs. Like
I think that you need models that, number one, they are transparent. Anyone can look at the data and repeat the analysis. You need models that have some source of responsibility for their reproducibility. So, for example, there's the US Forecast Hub and another one in Germany and Poland that modelers, many of them, put their predictions. And then a week later or 2 weeks later, you see what happened to them. And anyone can see that, they were correct or they were not. And then you can start ameliorating or fine-tuning your models. Then you need models that capture multiple dimensions. They don't look just at cases. They look at other types of impact. They look at hard outcomes for COVID-19, but they also look at other outcomes like the ones that we mentioned, mental health, other types of health care that would be dismantled because of whatever response. So you need to model multiple dimensions. You need models that are properly calibrated, that they use inputs that are fairly accurate, or if they're not accurate and you have uncertainty, they incorporate uncertainty. So infection fatality rate, for example, you cannot just throw one number there and say it's 0.9%, and then you run the calculations and maybe you're 6 times off. You need to allow for the uncertainty that you have in that. You need models that can be compared and can be assessed. And most of the models could not really even be compared. They were just thrown in vacuum, taken up by politicians and public health officials. Most of them had no clue about what they were buying, and then leading to policy that then there was the self-vindication clause that, well, yeah, it didn't happen because we saved you, which was like the most misleading part of all. So let's take the Imperial College models, which are by one of the best teams in the world. I think these scientists are amazing. So we looked at what they published in Nature, and we realized that they had another model that they had fit to US data. They had published a Nature model based on European countries' data. But at the same time, they generated a second model for the US, and the model that they used in the US had a much better fit to the European data as well. So we run that other model, that was their model, on the European data, and we saw that the conclusion was entirely different, entirely opposite. The Nature publication said that it was lockdown, the draconian version, that saved so many millions of lives. The best model by Imperial showed that it had no impact practically in almost any country, with maybe a couple of exceptions. In all countries, it was less draconian measures, more targeted measures, like not having these big events, for example, which I think made perfect sense.
Like the Imperial College model predicted, tens of thousands of deaths in Sweden in the absence of a lockdown. There were these like mass gathering restrictions, I think, in Sweden, but they didn't lock down. They didn't have mandatory stay-at-home orders, and they didn't have tens of thousands of deaths, right? So it seems like a falsification.
Indeed. Well, but this is really not going anywhere unless you have pre-specification and time-stamped that here's what I predict, and let's check 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 months, whatever you want down the road. And if you really want to go for much depth in time, you really need to have all the counterfactuals of what might happen that may affect your predictions, and make some assessments. I mean, here's what I think will happen, but if you do this, then I expect to see this. Now, then we may start talking. If we don't do that, it's just
John,
completely open to
I agree with
interpretation.
that, but I think the most important thing you said is broaden the scope of the models. You cannot fixate on a single number, how many cases are going to be, or even how many deaths are going to be from this one cause. If you're going to talk about society-wide interventions that are going to have so many multidimensional effects, the modeling, to be responsible, has to look at all of those, not just simply one of those dimensions of those effects.
I agree, and we have given far less thought to all the other dimensions compared to COVID-19.
Yeah.
And unless we do that, any inference is interesting as scientific curiosity, but I would not use it for policy decisions.
Right, because the mind fixates on the precise-looking number.
And I think that it gives an alibi for politicians and for policymakers to say that, well, my modelers say this. But to be honest, I think that someone with common sense would have done better than looking at very fancy models. It's sad, because as I say, that's the work that I do as well. So I count myself as a failure in that regard.
I mean, they're pretty, but I think they've had a malign effect in this pandemic.
Sad.
Okay. Let's change topic. This is now 6. So you've written on with large meta-analyses of hydroxychloroquine and other drugs that have been proposed as ways to treat and manage cases of COVID. And they've been enormously controversial. Especially the cheap drugs, have been enormously controversial. Same time, there have been a lot of drugs that have been approved with seemingly very little regulatory oversight, like a drug like remdesivir. Or actually, dare I say this, even the vaccines for use in children, for instance, with I would say very minimal evidentiary basis to making these decisions. The regulatory bodies have approved a lot of these sort of on-patent kind of medications and vaccines very easily, and yet the availability of cheap, especially so it's important because it's not just a disease of rich countries but poor countries. The availability of cheap drugs in widespread use is very important. If they could be available, could save many lives. But there's been this sort of it's almost felt like a pressure to not approve those kinds of treatments, whereas fast-tracked approval of many more expensive treatments or vaccines.
This is a huge conundrum, and it goes back as a problem way before the COVID-19 pandemic. So my core interest has always been evidence-based medicine, which means appraising the strengths and the weaknesses of the evidence. And what is like the most important frontier is medications and interventions in medicine. How do you regulate this? How do you say that we know that something works or something does not work? Basically, I'm pretty conservative. So my bias, to start with, is that I want to see evidence before I start treating people.
Right. Like you did a study of hydroxychloroquine, the literature on it, and it's found negative.
So
right?
hydroxychloroquine, we did an international meta-analysis. We tried to unearth every single randomized trial that had been done. We had all these investigators join forces with us. They sent us their data. We could look at what we had available. And I'm really sorry, but hydroxychloroquine, if anything, increased the risk of death. One might argue that most of these studies were with high-risk people at high dose, but if I had to pinpoint what is my best estimate, is that hydroxychloroquine, at least in high dose, in high-risk people, in late-stage disease, probably killed people. I don't know how many. Maybe it killed 100,000 people, but I think it was not a good idea. Remdesivir, multiple randomized trials, very early kind of authorization to make the drug available under lots of pressure. We have nothing to give. Same thing happened with hydroxychloroquine as well. I'm sorry to say, the evidence does not really suggest that remdesivir saves lives. Can I exclude a relative risk of 0.99? No. But based on the randomized trials that I have seen, it doesn't seem to save lives. Does it change a little bit your chances of getting out of the hospital a bit earlier? This is what we saw in the early studies. They have been cited thousands of times. If I had to bet, no. I'm really sorry again. So why is it still in the guidelines? Well, not all guidelines. WHO has a conditional not use type of recommendation. Most European guidelines are not in favor of remdesivir. NIH has a strong recommendation for remdesivir, but the remdesivir trial, the initial one, came from NIH. Yes. So I'm not sure that it's like, I come up with something and I say, you need to use it, Jay, from now on. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Maybe we can talk about some of the other medications, but before that, I wanted to address an economics point. There's a drug company that has a drug that's on patent. It hasn't worked in other settings, but they would love to find a use for it. They have a very strong interest in running a trial with an endpoint that they can pick, and have it be used. And they could put poor resources into it. On the other hand, you have cheap drugs that are off patent with nobody owning it, nobody with a financial interest in running these trials. In principle, you would expect an entity like the NIH, a public entity, to invest in those cheap drugs because they're solving a market failure problem by doing that.
Yeah.
They're doing an assessment. And yet, my view is that the NIH has not particularly put a lot of energy into the evaluation of these cheap drugs. Like there's an active 6 trial that's due to be done, run by the NIH on ivermectin, due to be done in March 2023.
Yeah. I'm all in favor of rigorous randomized trials. So I know that many people have killed each other over ivermectin or other drugs.
Yeah, but we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have to make do based on the
we have to make do,
evidence, right?
but honestly, we can get rapid, reliable answers of that sort. I think one of the great successes, for example, was the fact that we had large randomized trials like Recovery and Solidarity. They gave us answers within months,
Right?
with many thousands of people randomized, with hard outcomes, with mortality outcomes. And we could see that, treatment A, B, C, D did not work. And we had some success stories. We had, for example, steroids.
Dexamethasone.
Right, yeah. They work. They reduce mortality. Tocilizumab has a pretty solid mortality signal. Not as big, but it is there. Monoclonal antibodies, they also had a positive outcome for mortality. I mean, the question is whether they would still be useful with different variants, but that's a different question. And I think we should have done the same for other interventions, either existing ones that were to be repurposed or interventions that are new ones and that some company wants to make big bucks out of it. Yes. So I have nothing against companies who want to be rich.
No, I mean, I don't
work
I'm okay with
with
that.
companies. I'm sorry, but I'm there just to be a critical eye on the data and the evidence. But if someone can show me the evidence, I will be out there saying, use this drug.
Yes.
If they cannot show me the evidence, it will be like a Twitter war.
So how do you assess how well the NIH and the FDA have done in the United States?
Poor NIH and poor FDA. Let's please support them, okay?
But support might also involve criticism,
I'm not
right?
happy with many things that happened, okay? But I feel uneasy, especially in this kind of critical situation where everyone is blaming everyone. To start blaming, NIH and FDA and CDC.
Well, you used to work at NIH. So.
Goodness, yes, conflict. Tommy Fauci was my director. I love him. I mean, FDA, I have lots of good friends. CDC, I have wonderful friends there. So yes, I'm biased.
I've actually worked with the FDA myself. So
but why am I saying this? Lots of people are blaming others, and I think that tons of mistakes happen.
So I don't think it's a question for me. It's not a question of a personal mistake by the FDA or the NIH. The question is one of policy. I view the FDA as having a very important role in playing in evaluating the evidence on drugs and deciding whether it's sufficient based on the evidence to permit it, and it's the role of the NIH to promote and conduct studies.
So let me give you my personal opinion, which is very biased. So FDA, I think, are heroes, but they're completely outnumbered. Okay, they have very few staff, and they're bombarded by the industry, who is trying to pass everything that they can through the doors. And their funding, some of the funding of the FDA indirectly depends on the industry. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the arrangement is such that
PDUFA is called.
In the depth of your mind, if you work at FDA, you don't want the industry to fail. Do I want the industry to fail? No. Why should they?
No, you want if they have a good drug, you want it to succeed.
So I think we all agree on this. So FDA is completely outnumbered. They're trying to work under very difficult circumstances, against the odds, in a high-pressure environment where everybody is putting a knife on their throat. People are dying. I mean, I had heard that story with oncology way before the COVID pandemic. People are dying of cancer. Of course, they die every year. Millions die of cancer. But this doesn't mean that we should give them the wrong drug to make them die faster, or have billions of dollars spent on something that is not going to make them not die.
Yeah.
So in COVID-19, what we saw in oncology happening over 30 years was compressed within 3 months. The same pressure of 30 years megatones compressed into 3 months. Approve, approve, approve. License, license, license. Press the button, please. So it's. I mean, why should I blame my friends at FDA?
I also work with the FDA, John. So I think there's some excellent scientists, and I completely agree with you about the pressure.
Yeah.
But it's been heartbreaking to see some of the standards that I think the FDA generally has.
So it's people like me and you when people are under pressure at FDA to tell to all these people who attack FDA, come attack me, let these people alone.
Oh, John, I'm tired of attacks.
And the same applies to NIH to a large extent. I think that they did their best to handle a crisis that they had not met before, and they were not really prepared for that. NIH increasingly became more and more distanced from epidemiology, clinical research, evidence-based medicine. Someone needs to support lab research. I have very high opinion about this type of wet lab research, and I'm very supportive of it. And I think that more money should go into research in general. But NIH, unfortunately, was very weak on these type of disciplines that were badly needed in a pandemic. Because of course you need basic science of the wet lab type, but you need basic science of all other sorts. And for me, evidence-based medicine is a basic science. Right. And NIH just didn't have that. And CDC had personnel cuts over many years and funding cuts, and again, they were not prepared, and again, they failed to develop, for example, testing. That was a complete failure. I recall your early efforts to try to mobilize them to do the job that they should do, and then we tried to fill in the gap, and we got all the Rotten Tomatoes for that.
Okay, John, so that's halfway. Actually, we still have 4 more to go. Do you want to take a quick break?
I think I'm fine.
You're fine? All right, let's keep going. No, I'm actually good. Okay, so I'm going to turn from this, and actually it's related to this, what we just talked about. So you wrote a piece in Tablet lamenting the smearing and slandering of scientists who have worked during the epidemic. And you just mentioned Rotten Tomatoes, right? Those were actually very difficult times, like April 2020, May of 2020. It really did feel like we were being pelted with tomatoes for trying to understand the extent of the epidemic. What are your thoughts about actually, I'd love to start with maybe your personal experience with that. If you care to share about it, and then broader thoughts about how can we do better? Because I think that the kind of environment I think you're going to describe is not an environment where open scientific discourse can happen, where people can honestly disagree with each other in good faith and learn from each other.
That's a major problem, and it is a traumatic experience, both for myself and for others. Now I can probably laugh about it and talk about Rotten Tomatoes, but when it was happening, it was not laughable. It was, getting death threats and getting that sort of smearing and that sort of animosity, and not knowing if someone will walk into your house and execute you along with your family. It was not just me; it was also my family. My mother almost died from a social media hoax. They circulated that she had died of coronavirus, and people started calling her to ask her when is her funeral, and she went into a hypertensive crisis. She almost died. So I feel very sorry for all of these people who did this. I feel very sorry for them because it's very unfortunate, and I feel more sorry for all the attacks that were launched against people who had different opinions compared to mine. So if anything, I would like to protect those who disagreed with me more than the people who agreed with me. Because for a scientist and for any human being, there's no way that you can function. There's no way that you can feel a free person, a balanced person, if you're under such tremendous stress and just not being certain about what is coming next. It sounds crazy, but once you go down that crazy path, anything can happen. So I
could say like similar thing happened to me during those early months of the pandemic. I had a reporter who wrote a story about my wife. Now, she's a civilian in this. Yeah. She's not, and she's trying to do her best, but they put her in the national spotlight in a negative way. I felt like I couldn't protect my family. I also had the death threats, some racist attacks, this is probably good for my health, so I should probably thank them. But I lost 30 pounds just from the anxiety around that in a 1 month period.
It's just a horrible experience, and I'm trying to forget as much as possible. It's not possible to forget because this is still happening. I think if you just go to Wikipedia, this is being vandalized or attacked or censored, or you have crazy things added about me or you or others. It's still happening to a large extent. And I think that the only reply to that is, can we seek dignity? Can we seek some sort of reconciliation? And what I say is it is very sad that this thing happened to me, but I don't want to see that happen to people who disagree with me. And I think that I have seen many scientists on all sides of the story being attacked from different parts of the dissenters or clans that are formed, especially around social media much of the time. You had a horrible experience with the Great Barrington Declaration versus the John Snow Memorandum.
It was organized, right? So Francis Collins called me a fringe. Actually, I'm thinking of putting that on my business card, fringe epidemiologist, and asking people to join the club.
So goodness, I did not sign the Great Barrington Declaration, and I did not sign the.
Well, you don't like to sign anything, John. So
and the reason for that is that even before the pandemic, I had published a paper where I explained that I do not believe in signature collection for settling scientific debates. I believe that.
So John, can I make a defense?
Yeah, please.
So I have never signed a petition before the Great Barrington Declaration. Never authored a petition. It was the first time in my life, and I think I probably have one declaration in me in my entire life. But I'm still immensely proud of it. One of the goals of it, one of my goals in signing it, was to make clear that there was not actually a scientific consensus in favor of lockdown. Yeah. And that I think we succeeded. Right, tens of thousands of scientists did sign.
I think a million signatures.
Yeah, almost a million signatures for regular people. Tens of thousands of scientists, doctors, and so on. It seemed to me at the time, and still seems to me, that there really wasn't any other mechanism to make clear that there wasn't a consensus.
Yeah, Jay, can I congratulate you for the Great Barrington Declaration, and at the same time congratulate the people who created the John Snow Memorandum for what they did?
Let's clarify.
For the sense of social responsibility that you had. I mean, this is the way that I want to see it. That you and others decided that, goodness, something very serious is happening here. We have a major crisis. We need to offer our best. And this is what we think is the best. And people on the other side, the John Snow Memorandum, they did the same. And I have to say, I know many people on both lists, the amazing scientists on both lists, good friends on both lists. And as I said, I didn't sign anything, either these or others, because of my stance.
Let me agree with you, John. Let me agree with you. I think both the Great Barrington Declaration and the John Snow Memorandum, although there's lots I disagree with about John Snow, it was not an ad hominem smear. It was a set of arguments put forward by people who have in good faith, saying we should follow such and such a policy. And same thing, I think, with the Great Barrington. I mean, I know with the Great Barrington Declaration. That kind of engagement is actually good. Whereas the smearing, the death threats.
So this is what we need to dissociate. One is your intellectual and social understanding of the problem, and I think you're entitled to do this. And I think that people who are on the John Snow Memorandum are also entitled to do this. And to be honest, when I look at these documents, even though they're portrayed as being like light years apart, I think about 60% people would agree. I mean, there are differences. There's clear differences. But there's a lot of things that are common. I see people like Mark Lipsitz, an amazing person in this field. Many of his papers that I read, I mean, they sound a little bit like Great Barrington Declaration. He could have signed that, I believe.
Well, I had a debate with him in November of 2020, organized by Howard Bachner at JAMA. And it was more. I was surprised. At least I personally, I don't know if Mark would agree, but I found a lot of places where we agreed, like schools, for instance.
Yeah. So and maybe your agreement might have grown bigger over time, and it would be nice to have that conversation, and it could be private, it could be public, again. And maybe the acceptance and agreement rate is much higher now. I had a discussion with Mark the very same day I published my stat piece in 2020. And on the phone, I think we agreed on 98%. On what he wrote, it seemed like we disagreed a lot. But when we discussed it, I thought that we had agreed. I don't know what happened then. But at any rate, what you described was an orchestrated attack, to kind of take you down. And it's very unfortunate that Francis Collins in the conversation with Tony Fauci used that word. And I really feel very sad about it, because I have the highest
Well, I
opinion
admire
possible
Collins. I admire
for Francis and for Tony. I mean, they're my heroes. I believe they're amazing scientists. You know, I have been in committees where I was one of the people who said that we should give awards to Francis and to Tony, and it did happen. So, and I would do it again, you know, if occasions arose. I think that they're Nobel Prize level scientists, but that was entirely inappropriate. So I'm trying to think, goodness, what happened here? What happened to Francis? What happened to Tony? And my explanation, but I may be wrong, they said that you and the others in the Great Barrington Declaration are fringe epidemiologies. Okay, so I did a very quick exercise. I went to the National Library of Medicine, PubMed, and I put the names of 5 top journals that I believe are top epidemiology journals and also have epidemiology in their name. So Epidemiology, International Journal of Epidemiology, American Journal of Epidemiology, European Journal of Epidemiology, Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And then Fauci, A, and then Collins, F. How many papers have they published in these journals?
I don't think very many is my guess.
Tony has published 0, and Francis has published 1. And that one is with Terry Manolio. He's one of the senior authors. Terry is a wonderful epidemiologist, and I think the director of NIH had to be on board for that. So basically, Tony and Francis were making a statement about a field that have no clue about. They have no clue about epidemiology. They're top in genetics and top in infectious diseases and immunology, but they have no clue about epidemiology. And so I'm trying to think. So they must have had some epidemiologists about Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta and who's that guy, Jay Bhattacharya. And maybe that epidemiologist told them, oh, no, these people I want to kill
John,
everyone.
There was a very interesting email that, there was a BuzzFeed, of all places, had a Freedom of Information Act request for Tony Fauci's emails. And there was an email that mentioned you, John, actually, in the context of the Santa Clara study.
And?
It was 5 pages of redacted text written by Tony Fauci, I think. A huge number of pages. At the very bottom it said, well, we don't know any of the authors of the study except John Ioannidis. Someone should reach out to him and connect with him. Yes. There was at least one non-fringe epidemiologist involved.
I hope he has something good to say.
But he didn't reach out to you, did he?
I only have good things to say about him. So. But it's sad because then you start depending on people who you have to trust that they know what they're talking about. And I really don't know who were the people that Tony and Francis asked, and whether they were epidemiologists or whether they were some social media people. It seems like they asked people to write stories in media about you. I mean, that's not science. Wait a second. I mean, I just don't know what happened here.
There we have a case where there's a black and white email that suggests that there was such a campaign. But John, I believe there was probably a campaign. I mean, you've had many media stories written about you. Yeah. And how does that occur? Like, how does it occur that you become the focus of these sort of
I'm a bad person, Jay. Don't you know that?
And how does science occur?
A nasty person. I mean, it needs to be destroyed.
In all seriousness, John, how does science requires good faith conversations between people who disagree with each other, tempered by data, right? So we are all looking at the same data. We may have different conclusions about it, when we disagree in good faith. So I hope to learn from you, and maybe you hope to learn from me.
So evidence-based medicine says that if you smear someone, even if this is fake, the effect stays. So the credibility of that person and the ability of that person to make an impact, to have their work recognized, is destroyed. So even if it's completely fake, even if it is corrected at some point, it's very sad. It's very sad that we have reached that point in science. And as I say, if you have more smearing, don't smear my opponent. Smear me, please, because I hate to see that. I mean, I think I can take it better when people smear me rather than smear my opponents.
Okay, so question 8. What has the pandemic revealed about the strengths and weaknesses of science, and how science is used in society and in policymaking?
The pandemic has been a great opportunity for science. I have written about it several times, and as I say, I have always felt that science is not something that people are interested in. That you wished to have more people interested in science before the pandemic. I felt so lonely trying to talk about the scientific method. I had wonderful students taking my courses, but then going to the community and talking about reproducibility and methods and statistics and models and data sharing and research practices. Goodness, who would care about that?
Well, you had a broader audience than you probably realized, John.
Maybe, but I want to be a realist. I mean, I would not be able to compete against a rock star, isn't it? So suddenly, you have the COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody is interested in science. Everybody becomes a scientist overnight. They debate about science, they write about science in media, in social media, no matter what their background is, no matter what their training is. Now, is that bad? No, it's a great opportunity. Because now we can teach people how science works. And how does science work? Well, it works by being open, transparent, sharing, universal, not conflicted, using rigorous methods, trying to reproduce them, and encompassing uncertainty. These are the main lessons. Which one did we pass? I think we failed. We failed. And I blame myself for the failure.
We did produce the vaccine.
Yes, major success. Major success. So the prototype.
We, not meaning me, we in the
not
process.
us. No, we are the bad people.
Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
no, the good people in science produce the vaccine, and well, I tried to do my best to promote using vaccines, even more so in high impact, high risk populations. And I think it's crazy, not to vaccinate, but in a way, that sense that science is about moonshots and delivering miracle cures, that's the wrong lesson about science. Because science is about a series of failures that eventually leads to something successful after some time and after lots of efforts and after lots of failing people like me, get to have someone like you or someone else to do something that is great.
I think there's a lot to that, right? So the idea of science is we are all groping in the dark.
Yes.
And you find something, and it's not everything, but it's something. And then I, because you've found this, can find another thing. And we may disagree about what you found, but that disagreement leads to, a data, an experiment that helps us resolve that.
Yes. The way that I describe it is like swimming in an ocean at night. Okay, and I like swimming. I grew up in Greece, so I love swimming. I love swimming even at night. So I really enjoy this. Now there's sharks floating around, and there's big waves, and there's other dangers, jellyfish or whatever. The jellyfish are very annoying, I have to say. Twitter sounds like jellyfish, but I think that this is the message that we should have given about science, that scientists are basically well-intentioned people working very hard, making lots of mistakes, but eventually getting something right. And look at that, now we also have a vaccine, multiple vaccines, which is wonderful news. It's an iterative process. It's not an authoritarian process. It's not something that someone imposes. It's not something that someone mandates. It is something that is shared as a gift to the community, as an enlightenment, as knowledge, as benefit, as good, for the greater good.
Makes me want to be a scientist, John, the way you describe it.
But that's not what we sold.
Yeah.
And what I worry is that we sold the prototype of science as being miracle cures of all sorts, like these drugs that everyone believed that they're effective from day one, even though we had no evidence. We sold science as big pharma is good for you. Kudos to all the companies that produce vaccines, but goodness, I mean, this creates like a mentality that if you say anything about their studies, you are
a bad guy.
A bad guy, to be tortured.
And how about science as a sufficient reason for policy making? right? So follow the science. I think I found that incredibly annoying, right? So science is a contributor to help understand the parameters of policymaking, but it is not by itself a sufficient argument for one policy over the other. Science, in that sense, has no particular implication in terms of you must do X.
Yeah.
Right? It's more of a conditional thing. If you do X, you'll get Y. If you do Z, you'll get A. And do I want A or do I want that Y?
Science provides information, provides evidence. It changes the entropy of what we know or we do not know. And then decisions need to be made. The decisions need to take into account multiple aspects of science, of preferences, of shared decision making. We see that at the level of individual patients. We have the evidence, which usually has a lot of uncertainty, and then we have the individual patient who has his or her own preferences about what to do with their lives. And we just need to be able to communicate to that person as clearly as possible what we don't know, what we know, of course, what we don't know, how much uncertainty there is, what are the options, what are the pros and cons.
And then that person?
And that person decides.
Yeah.
So now we don't have a single person. We have like the entire world, an entire country, an entire county, thousands, millions, billions of people who we try to affect with science. We need to have the same shared decision making. We need to be able to take multiple dimensions, multiple preferences, multiple aspects of what life is, what we value about life, what makes sense for us, why are we still alive and not going to commit suicide. So all of that disappeared overnight. It just became, we know. It's a little bit like, I don't know, these minions, Domiletto. Okay, I know how to do it. And everybody jumping to do it the way that they knew how to do it. And that has nothing to do with science.
Yeah.
It's Despicable Me. I mean, that's what it is. And I love Despicable Me, don't get me wrong.
Okay, question 9. And this follows on directly. What reforms are needed to restore science? And then how hopeful are you about the future of science?
Reforms are happening, have happened, will happen. Science is a living experience. It's a living endeavor. It is not something that I should decide or anyone should decide. It's 35 million people who have co-authored scientific papers if you look at databases of bibliometrics. And each one of us is making some contribution. Some of what we contribute may be positive, some other things may be negative. We try to aim for more positive. I think that there's a lot of discussion, and this has been going on for many years now, that we recognize that there are strategic areas that we need to improve. We need to improve on all these dimensions that I mentioned before, how we do our research, how we communicate, how we improve our methods, how we share more, how we are more transparent, how we pay more attention to balances of benefits and harms, how we use the best analytical tools, the best models, the best statistics. So there's plenty of things to try to do things better. And I don't want to be a pessimist. I want to think that scientists want to make things better. And I believe that society should also want science to be improved, because it has become obvious that science can be an amazing tool, an amazing, powerful tool, but also it can create all these ripples of problems if it is misused. So I think the willingness is there. There's also obstacles. There's obstacles that go against transparency and more towards stealth, not share the data, not make something visible because we don't want to get into trouble. There's tendencies of conflicts becoming more prominent. I think
is there a problem of cartels? I mean, it seems to me from the outside that a lot of that it's a relatively small number of scientists. I don't know the number, maybe 100, 200, 1,000, that have controlled much of the discourse. And during the pandemic, in terms of what does science say, is that healthy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know whether I can put an exact number to that. If we stick to COVID-19, we saw a huge number of scientists publishing on COVID-19. Probably over 1 million scientists co-authored something. But as you say, there's probably a much, much smaller group that were very influential in shaping the discussion and in shaping also policy. And in many cases, actually, that group was detached from the real scientific literature. I mean, we've done some analysis, for example, looking at experts who are very visible in media in the US, in Switzerland, Greece, and Denmark. And a large share of them had never published anything on COVID-19. You know, they were in the news all the time talking about what we know and what we should do. And here it is, the wave is coming. And you know, I don't know how much of that was vindicated, but they had no scientific background on what they were talking about. There were many others that had very strong scientific background in this. And of course, there's others who may have published nothing and maybe had other types of experience. Maybe they were frontline physicians, for example, and so that, you know, of course, you want to know this type of opinion.
Sure.
I mean, if you've treated 500 people, you've published no papers. I prefer someone who's treated 500 people rather than someone who's published a paper. But I think that there has been imbalance of allocation of attention. There has been imbalance of running authoritarian themes through science and its interpretation.
And actually, it's been that's been leveraged with this almost remarkable sort of censorship of alternate views, right? So big tech will. I mean, you've had YouTube videos.
Yeah, I had a YouTube removed.
I've also had it. I think you basically, in order to be a influential scientist, you should have a YouTube video removed at this point, right?
I think so. Yeah, that was an interview where I said that science is the best thing that has happened to humans. so this had to be suppressed. I mean, science is the best thing that happened to humans. No way, get rid of this. No, I'm joking, but it's sad. I mean, you know, high tech is high tech. I admire what they do. I mean, they have improved our lives, my laptop, my Zoom meetings. I can stay protected while others are dying based on what they have offered me. But goodness, there should not be arbitrators of science. If they want to contribute to science, they can do it. They can, you know, put together their research or knowledge or whatever and share it. Actually, I think that it would be a big bonus if much of that high tech and stealth unicorn type of startups could share more of what they do. I mean, this is really my main concern that I had when I jumped above the parapet to say that Theranos is not worth it, and I was the first one and got lots of Rotten Tomatoes at that time.
Well, you've been vindicated on that, I think, pretty.
Goodness, yeah, but it took a while. And I think we should have more of high tech contributing to science as research and as research products, not as some high-level authoritarian censor mechanism, because they're not entitled to do that. They have no way that they can understand what they're doing. Yeah. They may have some consultants, you know, some scientists who allow themselves to be censors of the censors.
But that's the funny thing there is, like, if they're fellow scientists, that what they should seek to do is to critique, to referee, to like discuss, bring into discussion, not to suppress.
I think I'm not saying that we should not have scientists in these roles. I think actually we should have scientists in these roles. But having scientists in these roles means that you try to allow for the multiple dimensions of arguments. And of course, share the best evidence. And if people can see the best evidence, I think knowledgeable people and people with common sense, they will be able to say, yes, this is more likely to be correct.
Okay, John, so let me play the devil's advocate. As you said, scientists are always wrong. That's just by nature.
Very often.
Very often.
But eventually we correct our errors.
The public then sees sometimes not the best evidence. And is that dangerous?
The public sees a conglomerate of chaos. Yeah. This is what the public sees. And all of that is wrapped into some presentation that this is science, this is holy science.
Is this dangerous during a pandemic to show the public that messy science?
No, we should. Now, we should come out there and say, I'm Ioannidis, I'm an idiot, but I'm working hard to correct my mistakes. You know, this is why I'm a scientist. If I knew the truth and I had perfect knowledge, I would probably, you know, be a priest and a preacher.
Well, you'd be God. Some people think you are, John. I'm just so you know. I don't know if you know.
Oh goodness, no. These
a Greek god. That's
the death threats can kill me. Don't tell me that.
I mean, so are you hopeful?
I want to be hopeful. I want to be hopeful. I think that humanity should have a future. I think that science should have a future. We have such brilliant people. We have young people with amazing ideas. I mean, every time I teach something, I feel that I'm taught by my students. They can show me how wrong I am. I mean, this is why I continue doing this. Not because I have something to teach others, but because I'm there to be able to find out again, John, you were wrong again. And oh goodness, this is a
Isn't it great when a student tells you that you're wrong and that they're right?
It's the most reassuring thing.
Yeah.
You're still alive.
Okay, John. So question 10. This is a real treat for me, and because I'm pretty sure most of the audience that's listening does not know this about you.
Okay.
So from what I understand, John, you have written operas, and you teach a class on poetry.
Okay.
Is that true? Please tell
yes.
us.
Okay.
And where can folks in the audience find your work?
Okay. So I write literature. I have published 8 books in Greek. 3 of them were finalists for the Best Book of the Year award, the Ioannidis award in Greece. One of them in the English version will be published very soon. So I don't know if it's a matter
looking forward to reading it, John.
of days or weeks. But yeah, I look forward to giving more opportunities to people to say that John is a lost cause. But no, I really enjoy that. I enjoy writing. And I write in very mixed modes that might include poetry, prose, novel, theater, libretti for operas as well, sometimes intermingled to try to create some whole of a work. So when this book is published in English, I think that you will tell me, John, I lost every idea about
so
you.
Actually, I'd love to know, and because I don't actually know the answer. How did you get interested? Is this something? Did you always want to be a scientist, and this has sort of attracted you? This sort of like literary interest, or is this where it's competed for your attention the entire time?
So it has competed for my attention since I remember myself. I finished my first book when I was 8 years old. I bound it myself and I started giving it out to family and friends. I'm glad that it was not officially published. But, so I'm writing since I remember myself, and I really enjoy this. And there's a backdoor in communication with science. So science is reflected in that writing, but of course it's not an introduction, methods, results, discussion type of writing. It's a different type of approach to concepts, ideas, emotions, knowledge, and understanding.
It's a different language.
It's a different language as well, not just Greek versus English.
Right.
It's a different language in terms of how you communicate. But there is a backdoor and there is communication between the two. And I believe that some of the freedom that you get out of writing, it's something that is very common with science. You need to be able to think freely in order to write, in order to do science. If you're subjugated to some dogma or to some way that things need to be said or written, then you cannot write, and then you cannot do science.
This is something, I hope I'm not revealing too much, but like I remember one thing that you told me in a conversation we had during, it was almost like 6 months ago, that you actually had trouble writing because you didn't feel that freedom that you'd always felt your entire life.
This is true. I mean, for several months, I could not write outside of science, which I think I polluted the literature with many papers. But I think that you need to have a balance, and you need to have some sense that you're free to express yourself. And the environment was not the environment where free people were living. It was an environment of fear, panic, subjugation, narratives that were authoritarian, that you could not challenge. And I think if this happened to me, I can imagine what happened to other people. You know, I consider myself to be very uninhibited in a way. So if I could be suppressed, then I don't know what would have happened to other people. And the same happens to all arts. I mean, how do you measure the devastation of art during the pandemic? Yeah. I think that many artists probably just, I don't know if they will be able to come back. Many, you mentioned opera. We had one of my operas where I wrote the libretto. The music is by Haris Rondos. It was staged in the Greek National Opera. And we couldn't have it live. So it was videotaped and it was available for 6 months online through through your computer. But this is a very different feeling. It's a very different feeling to have opera as a living thing, as a living art, versus just seeing it on YouTube as you see a movie or as you see a lecture. We had another opera that we had endorsement from Stanford, from the Dean of Medicine and from the Dean of Humanities, to launch it at Stanford. And that was to happen in 2020. And we hope to do it, but still we haven't. And we just wait for the world to come back to its normal senses to be able to do it.
I've talked to many artists during the pandemic, and they describe the experience you had. Like that their work, their life's passion was deemed non-essential. And it was a personal assault on them, because the things that they valued, the way they connect with other humans, was taken away from them.
Indeed, indeed. And it's very difficult to measure that. I mean, in medicine we measure cases, hospitalizations, deaths, quality of life, adjusted life years. What is the quality of not having art, or having this minimal art, or having art that you hear to the musicians playing in Zoom? What is the quality of that? What is the loss that we have as a community, as human beings, as civilization, as culture? I cannot measure that, but for me it is immense. I was talking with a composer yesterday who's writing a symphonic poem based on my poetry. And he sent me the first part, and I loved it. And he said, "This is how we will launch a revolution." I said, okay, I'm...
You know, I think you're right, John. Actually, in all seriousness, I think in times of great suffering, very often great art comes of it, and healing comes of it. And maybe it's a revolution, but it's a revolution that restores the human spirit rather than...
It is a peaceful revolution.
Yeah.
It is a spiritual revolution. It is a revolution that you don't need to harm anyone, and you just benefit everyone. And isn't this what we want to do in public health? Isn't this what we want to do in medicine? But we also want to do that in other things like art. And I think that we don't give up as humanity. We still have some time to go, I hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you, John. We've now run through my very long list of questions. It was a real pleasure to talk with you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. The pleasure was all mine.